Bonjour, Tansi, bonjour, kwe, hello, good morning. It's nice to see so many dedicated people committed to Métis studies issues and to have you take your valuable weekend to participate in this event. So thank you very much for your commitment. Today and tomorrow we have an excellent lineup of speakers that will represent an intentionally interdisciplinary perspective on Métis studies issues. And it's going to involve a look at this area from historical, from political, from social, and from legal perspectives. And I was reflecting on how important that is this morning when I thought about how problematic it is for sorting out relations between the Crown and Métis peoples through an adversarial process like the judicial system and the court system, which only focuses on whether or not the Crown breached this obligation or that obligation, as opposed to a people-to-people negotiation of our respective interests, and what kind of forum may be more appropriate for that kind of relationship, as Paul Chartrand mentioned last night, that kind of compact. Compacts aren't built, arguably, in the courtroom. They're built in the political forum room. And it seems to me that we need to think about how best to proceed with our issues in that regard. Tomorrow there's also an opportunity for all of you to participate and break out in roundtable breakout sessions, where the idea is to think about some of the issues that have been presented in the conference, and to maybe think about how we can, as the Métis Treaties Research Group, go forward in terms of our research. It's a 5-year research project. We've got about 3 to 4 years left in the project, and we really would benefit, I think, from a wider discourse of what some of the issues are, how we can fashion or guide our research with respect to understanding Métis treaties and Métis issues broadly that inform how we should take this approach. At lunch, there will be a short tribute to Dr. Raoul McKay and a showing of one of his many videos he produced in a series called La Voix de Metis. In fact, it's the first video of that series. It's a 20-minute video. You can go upstairs, grab your lunch. They're boxed lunches. You can bring them down, and you can enjoy your lunch and watch a short film by Dr. Raoul McKay. I also want you to note that we are videotaping the conference, and the idea is to produce an edited version of the presentations and some of the commentary, and that will post it up on the Métis Treaties Project website, so a wider audience can benefit from some of the discussions and the insights that our presenters offer today and tomorrow. So this morning, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Melanie Mallet, who has kindly agreed to chair this morning's panel. I just wanted to bring to your attention that Professor Mallet was a co-editor in a very important book published in 2008 called Métis Crown Relations. And in that book, you'll find some excellent research, some excellent analysis on some of the historical problems with respect to the courts not having the full record because of the limitations of that process, and other important articles about legal rights pertaining to Métis people. So I very much appreciate my colleague having co-edited that collection and to chair this panel this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Larry. Good morning. Bienvenue. As Larry said, my name is Melanie Mallet. I'm honored to be here today and was honored when Larry asked me to chair this panel on the nature of Métis social and political structures. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I just want to take a minute and thank Alexandre Michaud, who's the research assistant for the Métis Treaties Project, and Véronique Larose for their help in organizing the logistics of the conference. I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will be presenting. And I thought we discussed this before. They'll each have 20 minutes to present, and then we'll save about 20 minutes, give or take, at the end for questions and discussion. So if we could, we'll hold questions to the end. We start, as we will with the presentations, in Montana, and then we'll head north. We start with Nicholas Vrooman, originally from New York, now in Montana. His diverse experiences include acting as the state folklorist for both the states of North Dakota and Montana. He has acted as the executive director of the Helena Indian Alliance, and he's consulted for the Métis National Council. He wrote the request, which he will speak about in his presentation, for reconsideration from the federal government for the Little Shell of Montana, of that claim. That process led to a change in the federal recognition policy for tribal recognition. He has also wrote, again, which I expect he'll speak to in his presentation, the Little Shell's policy paper on the recognition of fishing and hunting rights in Montana. So welcome, Dr. Vrooman. Beside Dr. Vrooman is Carrie Sloan of the Métis Nation of Greater Victoria. She's a doctoral candidate in the Law and Society program at the University of Victoria. Her work deals with critical Métis perspectives and how these can contribute to litigation and legal, understanding legal issues affecting Métis communities. She practices in Aboriginal rights law and has lectured on the subject at the University of Victoria. And we have Dr. Nathalie Kermoal of the University of Alberta. She's a full professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at that university. Her research areas deal with Métis history, including Métis Aboriginal constitutional issues, urban Aboriginal history, which she'll talk about in her presentation today, contemporary Aboriginal art, and Aboriginal women's issues. And I would add that Dr. Kermoal obtained her PhD from this university, so alumna. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Dr. Vrooman. Thank you so much.
Great. Morning. Morning. I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning and over this weekend, and to be invited from Montana to speak about the Metis of Montana and their relationship to what Canada has, this incredible dialogue over the name Métis and all that it means. I want to give thanks. I do come from south of the St. Lawrence down in Schenectady, and born and raised in that country, and long-time ancestral home, and used to come up here as a kid quite a bit, and so feel very, very close, and that's why I'm still on the border doing border work. And coming from Montana also, 20 years ago, a lot of Canadians didn't know that a whole lot of Canadian history, Métis history, really culminated in Montana, and that North Dakota and Montana held a very, very strong population and numerous chapters of the story of the Métis, which is, your story in a sense. Well, we come to realize actually it's our story, and I'm here today to really offer information about what's happening currently with Montana's Michif and how it relates to this larger story of Métis that we've been discussing now for quite a while, and really the energy has not abated whatsoever. I have to ask, is anybody here from the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Anybody under contract to the Bureau of Indian Affairs? We're currently petitioning for federal recognition, and under the new rule just came out at the beginning of this past summer, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs spent 3 years consulting in Native communities and the wider national community of the United States about rewriting the new rule. They were inspired to rewrite their regulations for acknowledging American Indians because of 5 issues that were beyond the jurisdiction of the Interior Board of Indian Appeals, which is a panel of federal judges. In October 27th of 2009, the Little Shell, after 31 years of petitioning under the old regulations that came into effect in 1978, after 31 years, they received a negative final determination. Now, in the year 2000, they received a preliminary positive finding. And so then 9 years later, they get a negative. And I read this negative final determination and just saw it as basically an old school social Darwinist, racist document that separated Montana's Michif based on their Canadianness and their mixed blood, meaning non-Indian. And so we were brought in by the Native American Rights Fund, who is the attorney for the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians of Montana. We have no Metis in the United States. We have only Indians. And so that's part of the dialectic that we have to overcome, because we know who we are, and we're from Pembina, and you know who's from Pembina, and everybody here knows what happened, 1780s on, and the spread through the Northwest, and the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, and how that folded in on what was happening aboriginally. And that's who we are. We're Buffalo Band Michifs, and we have to explain ourselves to the federal government in a way that they will understand. Anyhow, so we write this request for reconsideration, and the Interior Board of Indian Appeals finds that there are issues beyond their provenance and refer it directly to the Secretary of Interior, who today is Sally Jewell. She had just come on board there about 2 weeks when this happened, and she took 3 months to respond, and basically she said, wrote a letter to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior Indian Affairs saying that she thinks that they should reconsider their negative final determination of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians until these 5 issues are resolved. Immediately, the BIA began the process of community consultations to rewrite their regulations, and so now it is out at the beginning of the summer. The Little Shell are in a very unique circumstance from all the other 250 groups of Aboriginal people currently petitioning the federal government for recognition. We have about 550 tribes recognized by the government and 250 groups still unreconciled from the reconfiguration of the continent. And within those 250 groups, the Little Shell have a distinction, being the only group to have, well, let me back up for a second. Since 1978, when all of a sudden the Bureau of Indian Affairs took over the responsibility of federal recognition of groups of American Indians from the Indian Claims Commission, in that process from 78 until 3 years ago, when the process was suspended, that 52 petitions had been heard out of the 250. And of those 52 that had been heard, only 17 had gotten federal recognition. And the Little Shell are the only ones who have received a positive preliminary finding and then a negative final determination. The new rule, having to take into account these 5 issues, all of a sudden has opened up the door for the Little Shell because there are issues. Dealing with the border and dealing with mixed descent, mixed heritage peoples. So, and also for the first time, the federal government is allowing us to submit evidence of our own to substantiate our existence. In the old rule, it had to be determined from external sources as to external sources, that means the white community recognizing us as groups of Aboriginal people. Now we can submit our own evidence. And what that allowed us to do was to bring forward some incredible documentation that was gathered from the 1870s until 1900 by a man the name of Jean-Baptiste Bottineau, who was a tribal member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. We know who they are. And in 1892, the federal government realized that they did not have effective control over the northern third of North Dakota. That's from basically south of Brandon, between 30 miles west from Whitehorse Plains all the way over to the Montana border, a third down North Dakota on the south side of the Medicine Line, was unceded territory that was controlled by the Pembina Chippewa Band. And they needed control of that because white settlers had already moved in. They weren't going to go anywhere. They sent in a commission called the McCumber Commission, and the McCumber Commission forced out the traditional government of Chief Littleshell and his council, and installed what they called the Committee of 32, which was a puppet government of the federal government, and got what they wanted, and they paid 10 cents an acre for 10 million acres of land, and all of a sudden the United States had control of all of that. Well, in 1934 that came back around, and it was they realized that this was a boondoggle and that they had to rectify their skullduggery, as it were, and so they allowed a case to the Indian Claims Commission for all of those descendants of the Pembina Band of Chippewa who signed initially the 1863 treaty that ceded the strip along the Red River from Grand Forks to the border at Pembina, and then the 1892, which was all of the south of the Medicine Line to Montana, the top third of North Dakota. And who were those descendants of the Pembina Band? Well, we recognized them, and the Indian Claims Commission went through all of the documentation, the primary source documentation, of which most of it came from Jean-Baptiste Bottineau. And those sources today remain an incredible compilation of primary sources that describe in ethnohistory terms the genesis of the Michif people on the borderlands of the Northern Plains, and it names all of the voyageur progenitors as well as all of the Cree-Assiniboine Chippewa progenitors, the families that represented and intermarried at that point. And those names really are the genealogy of today's Canadian Prairie provinces in North Dakota and Montana. Indian Claims Commission went over the material and came to terms with that there was the portions, the Pembina tribe no longer exists, the Pembina Band of Chippewa Indians. It was fractured after 1863. It became the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. 1892, that group became fractured when the McCumber Commission went in, and they cleaved off from the roles, the traditional roles of who constituted the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. Everybody that the government said were either Canadian or mixed blood, meaning not Indian. And the traditional chiefs, Little Shell and the councillors, said, no, this is our tribe is more extensive than is here right now. They're out west hunting buffalo to survive. We are here because we are holding down the fort and our claim for our unceded lands at this point. And we have all these people in Montana and Saskatchewan. And the United States didn't listen to that. They cleaved off, and we have all these unrecognized people in Montana and in Saskatchewan, but in Montana. And they wander around, and we call them the landless Indians of Montana. 1896, we have a huge displaced persons refugee problem from the collapse of buffalo culture and from the cleaving of the Turtle Mountain Reservation, to the point where the federal government, Congress, passes a law called the Cree Deportation Act of 1896. That literally created a military roundup of all the Mitchifs in the state of Montana from community to community by the U.S. Army cavalry, rounding them up and force marching them to Great Falls, putting them on cattle cars, or force marching them all the way to the border to Lethbridge, letting them off. Everybody comes back, the majority come back at any rate, and end up in their enclaves and in the coulees and draws of Montana. And until 1916, it becomes a problem again. Decommissioned Fort Assiniboine that was originally there to clear the borderlands, 1870s through the 80s, it turns into the Rocky Boy Reservation. Still not enough resources, not enough land to handle the full population of all the Mitchifs, refugees, DPs in Montana. So that another cleaving occurs. And that cleaving, once again, is the Canadians and the half-breeds. So the people who self-identify ethnically as more full-blood are the ones who are left on the Rocky Boy Reservation. Now, biologically, these are the same people. Ethnically, they are traditional, and the people who are cleaved off are perceived by the American administrators as being Catholic half-breeds. And so those people today are who we call the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians, who have been petitioning since the 1920s to the federal government for federal recognition. We have a one-chance opportunity because of our circumstance to talk directly to the Assistant Secretary, Kevin Washburn, that really is able to show our relationship in as previously federally acknowledged as first cleaved from the Rocky Boy Reservation and from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, both groups federally recognized as a constituent group and a portion of the original land owning entity, the Pembina Band of Chippewa Indians, who are comprised of two ethnic groups, those traditional people and those Mitchif people. And we're feeling cautiously optimistic at this point that we will be federally recognized. Along with that, the Little Shell is also simultaneously expressing our hunting and fishing rights to the state of Montana, utilizing Paul Chartrand's shared sovereignty model, bringing in the Indian nations of Montana in joint petition of the state government and the federal government as the three sovereign groups within the American sphere who are co-residential to co-administrate the public lands and the wildlife of Montana. And a whole lot more to get into, and I'm hoping we can do that with questions that may come my way. There is a paper, Larry, that I'll turn over to you for future reference, and But just for information, an update on Montana's Michif. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if I'm too tall or too short for this mic. Thanks, Nicholas. It's really interesting for me to hear what you just said, because a lot of my family, after the Riel resistance, went down to North Dakota, and I apparently have a bunch of relatives in Turtle Mountain, but
Great.
my more immediate family were living in Dunseith. So, yeah.
I know it well.
Okay. Yeah. We can talk later. My name is Carrie Sloan, and I'm a Métis person from British Columbia. And Métis people in BC, I think there's not necessarily that much known about us in historical literature, even though there are a lot of primary sources. They haven't been studied a great deal. And only now people are starting to look into the oral history of Métis people in BC. So today what I'd like to talk about are some community perspectives of Métis people in the southern interior of British Columbia about litigation and negotiation of their Aboriginal harvesting rights. So I'm just got a few slides here. I do have a paper which I can distribute. It's a little bit long, so I'm not going to read that. So just so we know the area that we're talking about, this is just a map that shows some of the Fur Brigade trails. It's not complete, and of course there were a lot of other forts in BC where Métis people had settled. But if you look sort of in the southern interior, you see Fort Kamloops. And then there's a line going down that follows Okanagan Lake. That line sort of going down on an angle to the southeast is part of the area that I want to talk about today. In particular, there's some more detail right here. So there's a little Highway 97 from Kamloops to Vernon, and on that road, my cousins live in Westwold, and some other cousins live in a place called Falkland. And my grandparents moved from Saskatchewan in the late 1940s to Salmon Arm. And I have relatives all over sort of this area and down into the South Okanagan. And apparently I have lots of relatives all over BC that I didn't know about until I started doing my research. So there are 3 cases. I'm going to come back to that. 3 harvesting cases in BC that I want to talk about. And then I want to talk about a little bit about some negotiations that are going on between the provincial crown and Métis people. And then I'd like to give you some community perspectives on those things. And those community perspectives come from interviews that I did for my PhD research, which is about Métis rights in BC and also about some, I guess, Métis-based theoretical approaches to looking at law. And a lot of the people who spoke to me, I found out we were related and I hadn't known them before. And some of our paths had crossed before, even if we weren't related. So the first case I want to talk about, House, that was a planned subsistence hunt, and there were 6 Métis hunters who were charged. This decision came down before the Supreme Court decision in Pauli, so it was based on the Court of Appeal decision. And it was centered in the Kootenays. And actually, Mr. Howes, John Grant Howes, is a descendant of Jasper Howes, who was a trader and was in and around there quite a lot. And I'm also related to him, too. So in that case, the court said that there really wasn't enough evidence that had been tendered to show that there was a historic Métis community in the Kootenays. And we know that that's part of the Pali test says that you have to be from a historic Métis community and that there has to be an ancestral connection to that community. And the court sort of assumes that that's where Métis people are also going to be harvesting, is in the area where that community is, which is often not the case. So that was the first case. And then Mr. Nunn in the South Okanagan, that was actually a possession of wildlife case, and that also was decided before the Supreme Court decision in Pali. But the court said, again, there was no historic Métis community in that region. The Wilson case was decided after the Supreme Court decision in Pali, and it was a really interesting case, and I want to talk a little bit more about it than about the other two. Mr. Willison's family and my family actually crossed paths many times, first in Rocky Mountain House and then probably in Fort Kamloops, and then on the Sinclair expedition from Red River. And then he was actually born in Saskatchewan, and then we both ended up kind of a few miles from one another, if you like, in BC. And these kinds of crossing paths and interfamily connections exist between Métis of other areas and British Columbia. So at the trial level, the court said that, yes, there was a Métis community in that area, and he had ancestral ties to that community. And the appeal judge said, actually, they didn't disturb the finding about his ancestry or community acceptance or anything like that. But they said that they had imported a 21st century understanding of community. And part of the test that they were talking about in Pali says that you have to be from a community which has some sort of boundaries. It doesn't say exactly what, and that you have to be of similar ancestry and so forth. But they said they were too loosely connected. They weren't really from a particular area, and it was all too vague. And so they said, "Too bad, so sad." So that's where that is, and I'll talk about the community response to that case later. And because of those three cases, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, but at least in 2010, the BC Provincial Consultation Guidelines said that basically Métis people don't have rights in British Columbia, so we don't need to consult with them. And there may be some exception in the Northeast. I mean, there is quite a well-known historic community of Métis people in the Peace region. And now I think because there have been some consultations regarding this the Site C hydroelectric dam proposal, they did a land use study, the Métis Nation of BC did a land use study with people up there. And because of that land use study, they found that there's something like, I think, a medium level of consultation is required based on the land use. So because of that, now I think BC is reconsidering its position, and it may think about that again depending on what happens with Daniels. But MNBC, which is now the largest political organization representing Métis people in BC, has been trying to negotiate with BC for quite a long time, not successfully. And now there's another fairly large group, the BC Métis Federation, which has a relationship with the BC Crown as well. And I know there's other Métis organizations, and I'm not quite sure of their connections with the provincial government. So meanwhile, Métis organizations are practicing their rights, and they are trying to also manage them. There's legislation in place, for instance, that's been enacted by MNBC. The Natural Resource Act. And it's based in some ways on the traditional Métis law of the hunt. And it basically creates a system of hunt captains and assemblies and governs harvesting. And they issue harvesting cards, and you have to meet certain criteria in order to obtain one. This is just this is from MNBC, and it just shows the scheme and how the regulation of hunting works. And I'll come back to that as well. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some community perspectives. So that's kind of what's happening right now. People are still exercising their rights, and MNBC, for instance, has tried to regulate those to some extent. And I think people in their own ways locally also have some way of regulating the hunt or organizing it. And I'm sure that on a local level, people are also following the law of the hunt. So what a lot of community members told me about the cases is that they are, of course, disappointed in the results. Some people said that they felt it was good that these cases came up because it actually created awareness about Métis rights in BC. And there is part of the Willison decision says that there just has to be a Métis community on the land, which might be seen as expanding the definition of at least the territory that would be connected with the historic community. So that might be a good thing. But on the whole, most people are pretty skeptical about whether PALI would be useful at all for Métis people in BC or people who are in analogous situations. And people were generally a lot more in favor of trying to negotiate harvesting rights with the province. But one of the biggest concerns that came up for many people was that they were really concerned about whether negotiation had been going on with First Nations people. And in the 3 cases that I talked about, all of those harvesters said that they made an attempt to try and meet with First Nations people from the territories where they plan to hunt and get permission. And I don't think that worked out in any of those cases, but those people considered it to be an ongoing discussion. And I think that just personally, because I'm on the board of MNGV, and just from some personal discussions, I realize there can be lots of animosity and a lot of nervousness, I think, from First Nations about Métis people exercising our rights in people's territories. And to my knowledge, no one is claiming that there's specific Métis title in any place in BC, but people certainly feel that there are use rights or shared use rights. And I think on the ground this happens a lot. It may not go through chief and council. In fact, I know pretty much in some cases that it doesn't. So there are, for instance, a couple of hunts. This is a yearly hunt between Shwapmek or Shuswap and Métis people. And actually the Shuswap asked the Métis to organize the hunt, even though it's the Shuswap elders who choose where they go and some other things. So this is just a picture showing people drying moose. And I talked about this once at a Canadian Bar Association conference, and a quite prominent Shuswap person came up to me afterwards and with great consternation said, where did you get this information from? Who's doing this? Like, we don't know about this. But obviously on the ground, people know about it. This is a really, really serious thing. I mean, people got death threats and Métis people got death threats when it became clear that they intended to hunt in certain territories. To make things more complicated, there's also territorial overlaps. So in the case of Mr. Willison, the Okanagan people were quite upset that he was hunting in what they considered to be their territory. And they, I guess, didn't know about the trial before it happened, but they tried to actually intervene at the appeal level, which is a bit unusual. That didn't work out for them, but they did come in and observe the appeal case. But actually the Shuswap say, no, that's our territory. And so often, I think for Métis people, it's even confusing to know whose territory it might be, even if you're looking for permissions. And I know that Métis and Shuswap people have been working a long time to kind of improve their relations. So this was something that was really important to people, and some people expressed the concern that if you wanted to get involved in negotiations with, say BC, and you didn't deal with potential conflicts with First Nations, then you were going to run into a situation like what happened in Alberta when there was a provincial Métis harvesting agreement, but First Nations were really upset because they felt that they weren't consulted about that, and then in the end, Alberta abandoned that agreement. And then other people were concerned, though, that if you did try to work with First Nations, then you would never get anywhere with the Crown because it would take forever, especially because in BC there's so many complicated overlaps, territorial overlaps. But it was something that was really, really important to all the people I talked to. And just to give you a little bit of background on who these people were, there were 23 adult Métis people from the southern interior. Most of them, I would say, had Red River ancestry, but a lot of them also had local Indigenous ancestry, because it was very common for people to, say, people who migrated from up north or from the prairies to intermarry with local Indigenous people or Indigenous mixed-blood people. And a lot of them had lived in BC all their lives. Some of them were migrants. Yeah, I think I covered this. So, and the other thing that people said to me that really struck me was, even if litigation doesn't work out, and it might be useful to create a test case, but even a test case, say, just giving the example of Pali works really well in the facts, but it doesn't necessarily work so well if you have other facts. So you might create a perfect test case in BC, but it wouldn't really be applicable across the province. So people weren't super keen on litigation. They were a little bit more keen on negotiation, but with all of the provisos that I just said. But what they said that really struck me was they were really interested in just practicing their rights, and sort of like, whatever else happens, we're going to do our thing, which sounds like a pretty Métis idea to me. So their suggestions, the suggestions from the participants, again, litigation may be useful, but in a limited sense. Negotiation could be quite useful, and they had some hopes that might, the litigation atmosphere might improve over time. But for them, practice was most important, and practice could include a lot of things. So, thank you. So it could, for instance, include fostering good relations with Indigenous and non-Indigenous neighbors, which you could see as maybe being an incident of the law of the hunt. Because traditionally people did seek those kind of permissions, and there were conflicts, and I'm sure people all know about the treaty with the Dakota that Paul mentioned yesterday. Also developing other aspects of law and governance, Métis law and governance. And people also talked about the importance of researching history for litigation, but just for our own self-knowledge. And it was really important for a lot of people to teach Métis youth the skills, harvesting skills, wilderness skills, so that that part of the culture can be perpetuated. And the most key thing that people told me is to listen to the elders and other people who are wise about how to go forward. So that's all I have to say, and thank you for listening. Oh, I didn't say anything about those two slides, but the reason I had those two buildings up there, these are actually buildings that were built by one of my family members who came to BC quite early on, John McDougall, and he's also a relative of one of the elders I interviewed, who lives in Falkland, which is close to where Mr. Willison lives. That's his trading post was moved to the Kelowna Museum, I don't know, 20 years ago or so. So that's it. Thanks.
Kwe, Tensei, bonjour, good morning. I just want to start by thanking Larry for inviting me to this conference. And today I'll be talking mainly about the Canative example, which is a Canative housing corporation, and that was developed in Edmonton in the 1970s. And some of you may have heard about it, and others might be familiar with it, but I think probably a lot of people are not. And what I tried to do is to emphasize the politics around trying to have specific Métis programs geared towards housing at a time where a lot of people, a lot of Métis people, and also I would say Aboriginal people in general, were moving from rural areas to the urban areas and facing quite a bit of hurdles along the way. So I want to tell you a bit of that story. What is important to remember is that at the end of the 1960s and 70s, especially at the end of the 1960s, the urban reality, housing reality, was not to be seen on the radar of the federal government until the minister that was responsible for housing, his name was Paul Hellyer, released a report that was called the Report of the Federal Task Force on Housing and Urban Development in 1969. And he advocated incremental reforms rather than new government programs. And but Hellyer faced quite a bit of resistance at the time, and which led to his resignation, mainly because he had conflict with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and ultimately his report was shelved. But what's interesting when we're looking at the report, it was very fairly innovative at the time, and also still Ottawa did respond to the report and put a task force, established a Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs in 1971. And as one of the measures, this new ministry allocated $200 million to a number of demonstrating housing projects leading to urban nonprofit housing corporations. These nonprofit housing corporations were designed to meet the needs of Aboriginal families who were escaping difficult living conditions in rural areas in search of greater economic opportunities in urban centers as a way to improve their quality of life. However, when we look more closely, we realize that if the conditions were really difficult in rural areas, they were also extremely difficult in urban areas. And Aboriginal families face discrimination on a daily basis, which made finding a place to live extremely difficult at the time. So when we look at what has been written at the literature, what we realize is that there's a dearth of data and statistical information, especially around that time. And that is due mainly because when we look at the census, the Métis were not part of the census at the time. They were not a specific category of federal census of 1951, 1961, and 1971. So it makes understanding Métis urbanization patterns as well as housing needs extremely challenging. But there's a few studies that indicate that the proportion of the Métis was very important at the time of people living in urban areas. Evelyn Peters has done some of those studies, but also there was a report by Lagacé, especially in Manitoba, that actually showed at the end of the 1950s that actually there may have been more Métis in urban areas than First Nations. Overall, we see an increase, as the numbers show on the screen, of the Aboriginal population in Western Canadian cities from the 1950s to the 1980s, with a higher increase in the 1970s and 80s. So while moving to the city poses a challenge to Aboriginal cultural identities, as Evelyn Peters has shown, it also presents an opportunity for dynamic and resilient innovations. And that's what I want to focus on, the dynamic and resilient innovations, especially by focusing on this Aboriginal initiative, Canative, that was developed in Edmonton by 3 Métis men, Herb Belcourt, Oval Belcourt, and George Brosseau. And also it was at a time where the Métis were not on the radar of the federal government. They were perceived as a provincial jurisdiction, but also at a time, as John Weinstein writes, when a new set of circumstances caused a revival of Métis political consciousness and organization. So, as a first, I want to look at the Aboriginal context of the 60s and 70s very quickly. We know that Harold Cardinal in 1969 wrote The Unjust Society, and he focused on the fact that and him and other Aboriginal leaders were calling for socio-economic development, as well as the need for Aboriginal peoples to take matters into their own hands. And we're going to see that what Harold Cardinal describes for the First Nations was also true for the Métis. And the Hellier report actually talks about the Métis, which was a first at the time. And the Hellier actually says, well, you know, like when we look at certain areas, and especially Winnipeg, I guess a study had been done in that area, that a lot of that the Métis encountered more problems than First Nations. That's what Hellier said at the time, and that these people require special assistance and should receive it. So Herb Belcourt, we did some interviews with Herb, and he focused on the fact that he remembers that during that time, a lot of people, especially in rural areas, were living still in log houses, where there was a lot of, that people, the sun was shining through the logs, and there was usually one room, and there was 6 to 8 kids that were living in those houses. And he said that the poverty prompted people to come to the city, and there was some work at the time, but unfortunately, due to lack of skills and education, as well as prejudice, it meant that a lot of people couldn't find any decent housing. I looked at the Edmonton Journal because I wanted to have a sense of what was said of, the conditions of the Métis at the time, and First Nations also. And it's interesting because in the Edmonton Journal, there's a lot of articles that are actually referring to the bad conditions or difficult conditions that the Métis were living in. And we also find out that there was a lot of slum landlords, and that there was also a lot of landlords who were actually requiring for people to put a damage deposit, and for houses that were already in really bad shape, and requiring them to put that damage deposit. And then when people, and not doing any repair, but then when people were actually leaving, they would actually take the deposit, even though those landlords had not done any repairs. And also, what we're finding out when we're looking at the Edmonton Journal is that there was a lot of there was clearly, how can I say that, a lot of money that was required for the people, like their rent was really high for the type of housing that they could have access to. And at the time, we're talking the 70s, some of the families had to pay a rent around $400, which was a lot of money for the time. So how did we come to the birth of the Canative Housing Corporation? What we see is that Aboriginal organizations in the 70s identified housing as a #1 priority for action. Poor housing conditions were perceived as a primary obstacle to optimal use of other programs for educational, health, economic and cultural upgrading. And indeed, without decent housing, millions of dollars spent annually by government agencies on and other programs were actually wasted. And Ellio's report, as well as the Jean Réaume task force report that was published in 1970, emphasized that there was clearly a lack of an integrated, coordinated approach by various federal agencies to the problem of Aboriginal housing as a prerequisite to raising their standard of living. This was particularly true within provincial jurisdictions in relation to programs and services to Métis and other native people. And the net effects of all this is a hodgepodge of desperate, often conflicting programs that create administrative inefficiency and a frightening waste of desperately needed housing funds. And the Hellier report actually said we need to give a chance to the different programs and we need to try them for a long term in order to make sure that eventually that they will work, and then we can put money into that. So it was one man that did make a huge difference, and his name was Walter. These are some of the slums in Edmonton in the 1950s. And Walter Rudnicki was the executive director of the CMHC at the time, had a major impact on Aboriginal housing policy. He was committed to improve housing for Aboriginal people, but more specifically for Métis people, which was a first since the Métis were usually left out of such programs. And he organized an emergency repair program and a winter warmth program in 1971. And he also appointed a man, his name is Jean Réaume, who some of you, I'm sure, know. He was a Métis from Gruyère in Edmonton, and to lead a national task force on Métis housing. And Réaume actually got a number of people around him, and one of these people was Louise Hayes, who was former secretary to John Diefenbaker, and Gordon Hornby, former bush pilot and administrator. And according to Louise Hayes, this was something that had never been done looking at the whole situation regarding Métis housing in Canada. So the results of Réaume's travel across the country was a background paper in support of federal policy on low-income housing. And what happened afterwards was mainly like to try to see if there was any possibilities of doing something more specifically with the Métis. And then he met Herb Belcourt in Edmonton. And eventually, a team of Herb and other people went to Winnipeg to meet with Walter Rudnicki, and then eventually decided that it was time to have a corporation, a Métis housing corporation, that would serve specifically Métis people, but also Aboriginal peoples in general. And so Herb had a specific way, he looked at it in a specific way, and he thought that it was very important that the task force, he said to the task force, that a housing society should be run as a business, able to stand on its 2 feet and be financially accountable. So he insisted on that, and he said that at the time he also emphasized the fact that these type of corporations shouldn't just receive money from the government. It should have some kind of self-government or self-way of administering its finances. So the Canative Housing Corporation was incorporated under Alberta law on July 22nd, 1971. And Canative was funded jointly by the Central, to begin with, by the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation and provincial housing funds. 95% of the funds at the beginning were coming from the CMHC. So to a certain extent, there was a lot of dependence on the CMHC. But the corporation was to operate on a non-profit basis, and the bylaws clearly stated that the company was not formed for the purpose of gain and that no profits would be paid out of to shareholders. Ultimate dissolution of the company would be followed by transfer of assets to recognized charitable organizations. And the stated intent of the corporation was to establish and maintain residential accommodation for residents of the province of Alberta of Indian ancestry, provided such residents shall be persons of low income consistent with the naming as defined in Section 2 of the National Housing Act. And also, in the bylaws, it clearly says that there was a need to have a complete orientation program to facilitate the tenants' adjustment to the urban scene. What's interesting is, like, when we're looking at the archival documents, what we see is that a number of people had ideas about what Canative was supposed to do, but also some MLAs clearly saw the importance of having such organization. And Dave King, who was a provincial Conservative MLA at the time in the 1970s, and he was representing the inner cities of Edmonton, was well aware of the housing needs in Edmonton. And he said that at the time the corporation had three main problems. The first one was Canative was trying to promote an entirely new business and social model for that day that was not yet part of the establishment. The second one was Canative had to deal with two large bureaucracies, provincial and federal. And then the third one was the corporation's leaders were Native people. So how did they navigate the troubled waters of politics? So at first, the relationship with CMHC seems to be fairly smooth, but as time passed, the relationship was clouded with tensions due to the fact that Canative did not operate in the way the CMHC wanted them to operate. First of all, against the will of the federal government, Canative discarded the idea of buying houses in specific city blocks. The group fought to stay away from this idea. So this was an idea that was very, that you could find everywhere throughout Canada, and the federal government was actually pushing that. But Canative, well, the leaders of Canative decided they didn't want to do that, and mainly because they believe their tenants should have access to the middle-class neighborhoods, the same school, bus and library services than other people, the same shops as any other urban residents. Sometimes neighbors of newly purchased homes would come down with a case of not in my backyard syndrome and make a fuss about Native families moving in next to them. And Herb Belcourt's solution was to go and visit with them personally and calm things down. So he would knock at the door of neighbors and then would explain what they were actually trying to do. Also, if we look at the National Housing Act at the time, rents were based on a sliding scale. It was a subsidized rent geared to income arrangement. And the group actually opposed that. So they pushed against it because they felt it was not creating stability for the families. And according to Orville Belcourt, with whom we did an interview, he said, rather than being able to build equity and establish stability in your community, any success you made in your social and economic life were impacted as your financial situation improved. So you would end up held up under CMHC's formula. Our rents were not subsidized according to CMHC's formula, but they were below market rents. So there was a difference of 20 to 25%. So usually the rents were around $250 in the 1970s. Canative also faced slow-moving or reluctant bureaucrats. According to Herb Belcourt, one example was that the CMHC only advanced us money as we bought houses, and there was a lot of bureaucracy to go through each time. And also, according to Walter Rudnicki, the challenges faced by Canative Housing Corporation is in part due to the jousting between different political factions, inside the CMHC. People like Rudnicki and Bob Andrus, who was the CMHC minister without a portfolio at the time, were determined to transform the crusty old housing corporation that could not conceive its role as anything more than a prudent lender into a modern 20th century mortgage and housing corporation. And he said that the old guard actually resisted having Métis programs and native programs in general, and then actually made things more difficult for the Métis and for the group, for the Canative Housing Corporation. By 1972, Andrus, due to some of the tensions and the jousting, Andrus was transferred to another portfolio. And in 1973, Rudnicki was fired from his position at the CMHC. And Canative from then on was under the scrutiny of the CMHC, which led to a court case in the 1980s. And they also faced criticisms from other native organizations. So to conclude, the Canative story provides an excellent case analysis of the success of dispersed low-income housing facilitated by social programming and the antagonizing political and economic structures within which Métis social housing learned to thrive. Even though Canative worked in partnership with the City of Edmonton and the provincial government, it had to fight criticisms as well as the scrutiny of the federal government through CMHC to keep its autonomy. Nonetheless, Canative was extremely proactive in designing a whole range of services to help urban Métis families not only get back on their feet, but also to improve their lives on a long-term basis. They understood that socio-economic reasons led to core housing needs, but that a roof on one's head was not enough. It had to be paired with other services and educational programs to be a long-term success, which at the time was innovative. A discussion paper prepared by the Métis National Council in 1993 perceived Canative as one of two models, and the other models were also an Alberta model. And they said to gain some insights on the extent to which it is possible to build on these initiatives. So in the 1970s, Canative challenged what it meant to be Aboriginal and living in a big city like Edmonton. It overcame many barriers, some institutional, some race-based, and demonstrated with a lot of determination amidst the criticisms that a business led by Aboriginal people could be successful. The implementation of housing programs was largely the result of intense lobbying by Métis individuals and relied on the goodwill of a few enlightened politicians at the time when Ottawa's denial of jurisdiction had placed the Métis at an acute disadvantage relative to other Aboriginal people. Thank you very much.
Okay, pardon me. Thank you very much for those presentations. Because our presenters were so disciplined, we have about 20 minutes for questions. I see that there are microphones at the back of the room, and I think I would invite you to address your questions to the microphone so that they can be included in the capture of this presentation. So I open the floor. I see Mr. Chartrand. It's on.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for your presentations. I just wanted to ask the last speaker if you know Ed Swain. Ed Swain was Mr. Métis Housing in Manitoba. He now lives in one of the Métis settlements north of Edmonton. If you are interested in adding to your research in housing, Ed knows everything there is to know about Métis housing, including how the Manitoba Métis organizations made a profit out of operating their housing program, which was funded by the government, and how they did very well. I think it was $3 million a year profit, but the bureaucrats didn't like to see some Métis making $3 million a year on the same rates that the bureaucrats have been operating on and going broke. So they changed the formula, funding formula, so that they wouldn't make any money. So I think that's another very interesting case study that, it appears if you're interested in housing and, Métis housing, Ed doesn't live too far from Edmonton. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is another question at the back?
I want to thank the panelists. I'm going to ask.
We can't hear. We can't hear.
Hello.
Jason, or
Gotta raise it.
I think you might have to adjust it. Jason in the sound booth in the back.
Hello.
Is that better?
I'll put my teacher voice on.
Yep.
Okay. I'll add a Saskatchewan story to the Métis story. I grew up in one of those Métis houses in Saskatchewan when CMHC was working with different Métis organizations, and my father was actually one of the people who was constructing them at the time. And my parents still live in that house. So in the little community where I come from, Indian Head, Saskatchewan, the housing that was getting built was dispersed through the community for all of the reasons that you mentioned, actually. And it was a small community, maybe 1,500 people. And this was happening throughout Saskatchewan, and people would be able to select where they wanted to live. So my parents selected someplace just outside of the sort of main body of the town where some newer houses were being built. And the community reacted, right? There's going to be half-breeds out there, and there's some new houses going up there that they were worried about diminishing the value of the new housing that was going out there. We were getting our nursing home, all kinds of things like that. About a year before Jim Sinclair died, he was having coffee in a mall downtown in Saskatoon, and I saw him and went over to say hello. And we got talking about where we lived and how we grew up, and he talked about the political environment at the time and how CMHC would dole this money out at very, very small increments. And he said he remembered one day walking into his office where his secretary said, "I am so sick of getting nickeled and dimed by these people." And he said, "Good point." And he took the most recent donation from CMHC, and I can't remember how much it was, but it was probably $60,000 or $80,000, something like that. And he got his secretary to go to the bank and get as much cash as she could, and then to go to all of the banks and translate that money into nickels and dimes. And then they took some of that money and they bought some wheelbarrows. And he said, "I remember saying to everybody, do not touch one nickel or dime. We are delivering all this money back to CMHC." So, Jim was big and wanted fanfare and he knew how to use the press. And so we had this huge press, and they went to CMHC with their wheelbarrows full of nickels and dimes, and they dumped all the money back and said, "You can't nickel and dime us to death." And they went back feeling so great about what they had done, and we've made a statement here, and they're going to listen to us now. And about a week later, after the CMHC employees had to pick up all those nickels and dimes, they got a phone call. "You're short $76.28 or something." And he was furious. "I told you guys not to touch that money." So then they started thinking, who would take $75 or whatever it was? Well, it was the cost of the wheelbarrows and the things that they had bought. Wheelbarrows and shovels, I believe, that they had bought. So they had to go then and deliver the wheelbarrows and shovels. So there was political activism to show in a big way what was going on in Saskatchewan in the same way. But I have looked and cannot find any news items on that, and he made sure that the press was there, but excellent work. And it was, when somebody says, "What's it like to grow up as a half-breed?" you don't think about the things like, "Oh yeah, I grew up I grew up in Métis housing, actually, in Saskatchewan. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Herb Belcourt, in the interviews that we did, talks a lot about all these hurdles and trying to go around it and trying to make sure that it would be possible to have houses for the different families that would come in town. So yeah, like it's. And also we find that, as I said, the Edmonton Journal talks about those issues. And but I'm still in the midst of doing all that research, which is huge.
I'm going to take a question at this microphone. Yeah.
Thanks. Mike Evans, the University of British Columbia. Carrie, my question is for you. You're a McDougall descendant?
Yes, I am. So
I want to ask a little bit about micro-treaties that are marriages. Forgive the maybe appearance of trivia here. Jean-Baptiste McDougall had many children, most of whom were sons, and most of whom married into the Okanogans, as I'm sure you're well aware. Not all of whom married into the Okanogans, but most of whom married into the Okanogans and then became Okanagan. Their children became Okanagan. So my question is, in the context of the conversations in the interior, whether and how the common history that are the McDougalls between the Okanogans and the Métis in the region has any potential for the source of accommodation and reconciliation between the Okanogans and the Métis.
thank you for that question. Is this on? Can people hear me? I'd like to think so. But I know there's a woman who's an Okanagan historian. You might know her name more than I do. I want to say her name's Shirley Louie. I don't know. Do you know her? And she mentions a lot of those families, but she never specifically says that they're Métis. And Lottie McDougall Kozak, who's my cousin, knew her and tried to talk to her about that, but said that she didn't really want to talk about that. And I've talked to other people about similar stories, and I actually found a lot of people that I interviewed had some family connections or friends in the Okanagan Indian Band or in the Shuswap or other First Nations. And people had sort of been reluctant to really say that, oh yeah, we're related. I mean, people know, we know that, but sort of for political reasons, people felt reluctant to talk about it. So I think it would require a lot of work and education, but I think it's a possibility that there could be some basis for dialogue there, for sure. I just saw an interesting article my uncle sent me. My uncle lives in Kamloops, and it was with a Shuswap elder from the Kamloops band, and she'd said that the Larocques, there are a couple of branches of the Larocque family who were trading in Kamloops, and that apparently they had married into the chief's family quite a long time ago, and this woman had said that the Larocques are one of the founding families of the reserve. And it was just in one of the weekly newspapers in Kamloops. So people know those things, but maybe they don't talk about it a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to take Mr. Belcourt. Oh, Mr. Prefontaine. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for the great discussion. Can you hear me okay?
I think you might need to raise the microphone.
Is that better?
Can you hear? Can everyone hear? Yeah.
Can you hear?
Okay. Yeah.
I have a couple of things I'd like to bring up. Just a few minutes ago, Marilyn was talking about Métis housing in Saskatchewan. If anyone is interested in reading about that, New Breed magazine has a lot of stuff on that topic, and we've digitized that and put it on our virtual museum of Métis history and culture. And Marilyn, I think the story you were talking about, I do believe it's in New Breed somewhere. I remember coming across it, so I don't know where. Somewhere in the 1970s it's there. I have another question, or comment rather, and this is for Carrie. What do you think of Jean Barman's research, particularly with her new book, French Canadians, Furs, and Indigenous Women? And how do you think that book and her research will impact litigation for Métis in BC?
Yeah, Jean Barman's work is very interesting to me, and I can disclose that she's on my committee. So Yeah, her new book, I've just started to read. It's super popular. It went missing in the library, and I've had to re-request it and stuff, so I haven't been able to finish it yet. But I think her work and her work with Mike Evans just shows some really interesting connections, I guess, between Métis people in BC and elsewhere, and also between Métis people and local Indigenous people. And I think that might be helpful in just being able to show that there were historic Métis communities in BC. Yeah.
My reading of the book, though, where I don't know whether, she didn't talk so much about BC, but the Pacific Northwest, when she argues that the descendants never embraced a Métis identity. They kept that Canadien and whatever their First Nations identity was. Do you think judges and Crown lawyers will use that argument to fight against Métis rights in BC? Or you haven't, read through the book to fully?
I mean, I know that she's focused on the French-Canadian men, and not only French-Canadian, a lot of them were actually Michif, or some of them were Iroquois, half-breeds and stuff. No, I'm aware of that, but it's tricky because I just think about, I have Red River ancestry, but my grandparents never went around saying, oh, we identify as being Métis. As my grandma said, usually we were worried about getting enough to eat. So we weren't necessarily, I don't know how much that means. And there's so many discussions that we could have about how people identified and their political connections and stuff. I'm sure that people could use that as an argument for there not being some sort of unified Métis consciousness, and I know other people, I think Olive Dickinson has said that there never was some sort of unified political awareness among Métis people in BC. So I know about that, and I don't know enough about the history to be able to say any of those things for certain. I'm not saying that there necessarily were people that had that degree of political cohesion, and whether that is, what degree of political cohesion is necessary to satisfy that test. That's a really interesting question. I don't know that that's resolved. I could say a lot more on that, but I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Belcourt?
Hi, my name is Tony Belcourt. You have to forgive me if I'm a little nervous, maybe a bit emotional when you talk about Canative. It certainly reminds me about when we first moved into Edmonton and the kind of prejudice that we experienced and the difficulties my mom and dad had finding us housing, half-breeds coming from Lac-Saint-Anne. And I'll never forget, and I don't think it's written in history anywhere, but the idea of Canative started when we had a meeting of Local 101 in Edmonton, and I was president at the time of the local. We had that at my mom and dad's house, a little rented house, 74th Street in Edmonton. And the local was made up mostly of my family and Herb and my brother Orville were certainly there, and so were my sisters and other cousins. Stan Daniels, the president of the Métis Association of Alberta. And the idea to start a housing project started there. It was an idea that come from the Métis people themselves about what they wanted to do for themselves. And eventually, the houses in Edmonton and Calgary that had been purchased were sold because there was no need for Canative anymore. The social housing programs of the government, plus the Métis Nation of Alberta's housing program, outstripped the need for those houses. So they were sold and put into a trust fund, Belcourt Brasso Métis Foundation. And now, every year, that foundation gives grants of up to, I think, close to $1 million to Métis students in Alberta to go to college and university. It's just an amazing story. And because of that story, and this subject is all about reconciliation, that kind of action shows how reconciliation can take place between Aboriginal peoples and others just by the positive things that we do in our communities. I just had to mention this because this is a part of history that I wanted to mention. The other thing I wanted to say is that in terms of reconciliation with First Nations people, and particularly over competing interests, there's lots of stories that I personally have to tell about that, but in terms of hunting and fishing rights in our province of Ontario, we had worked very hard on developing good relationships with First Nations in this province to get them to understand who we were, the historic relationships, which include blood relationships of the families and the communities, sharing of traditional territorial land, culture, and spiritual values, all of that history. And we talked about it and ended up with a nation-to-nation relationship between the Métis Nation and the Anishinaabe Nation. And then when the Powley case had made its way to the Ontario Court of Appeal, the Ontario government asked the chiefs of Ontario to intervene on their side. And the chiefs of Ontario, under the leadership of Charles Fox at the time, said, no, we won't do that. We had a good relationship. One of the reasons that relationship was developed, because when we talked to chiefs, we said, look at us, the Métis people in this province, maybe 400 or so, a little more than 400 that actually go out to hunt moose. Yet in the province, there are 17,000 adult moose tags that are handed out to sports hunters every year. An unlimited supply of calf tags that are handed out to sports hunters every year. What possible threat are 400 Métis people going to be to the moose population? We should work together, Métis and First Nations, in terms of the co-management of these valuable resources, because we know they're dwindling. I mention this because I see from afar in British Columbia the kinds of animosities and fears that grow, that have grown. It's not only in BC, but it's almost everywhere I can think of where Métis are concerned, and they still go on in Ontario. But it comes from direct relationship building with First Nations. I believe that we have had treaties between Métis and First Nations. That's clear. That's historic fact. These relationships need to be nurtured and continued. But first of all, they need to be known about by all the people that are there. Hopefully, this project, Métis project, Treaties Project will help to do more of that. We're going to be seeing First Nations that are going to be coming to these kinds of events in the future.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Well, sorry. We're at, Larry, do we have, I see it's 10:30. Are we, I think we need to wrap up, but I'm sure there'll be opportunities for everyone to discuss some of these issues at the breaks and throughout the weekend. I'd like to thank our conference speakers. I'd like to thank everyone who offered questions. And on behalf of Professor Chartrand, the Métis Treaties Project, and the conference organizers, I'd like to present each of our speakers with this beautiful book by Mr. Préfontaine about Gabriel Dumont. So thank you.
Okay, in terms of, actually, I really enjoyed that panel. It kind of shows the importance of a Métis-centric understanding of place and time, and to not forget about looking at our history from that point of view in terms of Montana, British Columbia, or the history in the 60s and 70s. I remember when I was a kid, my parents tried to rent an apartment or house in Medicine Hat, I think it was. And my mom's non-Métis, but my dad's Métis, and quite obviously so. My dad had to stay in the car while my mom approached the potential landlord. So that's how racist it was back then. We couldn't rent, my dad couldn't rent a place. My mom had to do it. So that, you know, it's important that these histories come out, I think. Although I'm not all that happy about that one. So there's about 10 minutes for muffins and coffee upstairs. We're going to resume back here. We have a second panel coming up. But I also want to point out that most of the presentations I will be getting from the presenters and posting them up on the Métis Treaties website for participants to access after the conference. I also want to point out that Paul Chartrand's address from last night is also available out front if you want to pick that paper up as well. So I'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.